The Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, in partnership with Wits University School of Governance, has launched a book exploring protest culture in the country entitled Protest in South Africa, Rejection, Reassertion and Reclamation. Co-editor Rekgotsofetse Chikane joins us now for more. Good evening to you and welcome to the program. I want to kick off with this one. As a former student activist, what insights can you share on the fact that student protests, like the ones we are seeing at Wits and UJ, and as we've heard from University of South Africa, 8 concurrent protests around the country each year, seem to have at their nexus similar issues?
Yeah, so when you think about the notion of protests on university campuses, and you think about the logic of a protest that is intended to shut down the university, we've actually had this for the last 20 years, right? Every single year. Sometimes it happens at previously white institutions. A lot of the times it happens at previously black institutions. But what this tells you is that the underlying logic of the relationship between the university management, the relationship between the university system with students as a whole, is something fundamentally flawed. There's something wrong with the business model that when the clients, if you had to use that particular language, are advocating for some sort of grievance within their situation, whether it is for 1,000 students or whether it's for 30,000 students. The fact that universities have not been able to comprehend what those challenges are and solve them in the long run means there's something fundamentally wrong with the university system. And I think what we're seeing here is the cracks, or maybe not cracks, but the outcome of not resolving a long-lasting situation within universities.
I wish we could dwell on this a little bit more, because I think you might have some really beneficial insights and contributions to the debate. But we're going to tease it open and widen the aperture a little bit and look at protests in South Africa. This book is a response to the dynamics and some of the causal factors of protests since democracy. I mean, that is a gargantuan body of research that you undertook. What are some of the big trends you identified?
Yeah, so the one big thing that we were trying to do within this book was trying to not limit the idea of protest to South Africans protest because there's poor service delivery, right? That's usually the common norm that people can understand protests as being. What we're trying to do with this book is trying to show that how nuanced protests are, that indeed service delivery is quite poor and that initiates protest action, but these other issues that are at play. Right, so these 2 chapters in the book that look at the relationship between police and citizens. One of the chapters actually looks at the amount of police-related protest actions. One chapter looks at how the nature of the police has evolved over the last 20 years to be more adversarial with communities. We have other chapters that show that because of the lack of service delivery, the protests aren't happening against the state, but within communities themselves. Right, so what we're seeing within this book, at least within all our chapters, is that within the South African protest landscape, there are various different nuances to the idea of understanding protest, whether it is citizen to state, whether it is citizen to citizen, whether it is citizen to the private sector. And understanding these nuances gives us a more holistic idea of what protest activity looks like in the country, and by fiat almost, gives us a better idea of what grievance looks like, what the idea of we feel destitute, we feel that we need something more, we feel that we no longer want to be left out of the social system or left out of the social contract of society. And I think this book really, really tries to espouse this idea that protest looks very different in the country, but advocates in a way that is quite common across multiple cities.
So the protests of July 2021 really shook the country in a way that other protests post-democracy perhaps didn't. What did you learn from how it happened, developed, and was managed?
Yeah, so we actually have one of our chapters in this book that really speaks to the July unrest and really highlighting that the July unrest was quite different from how protest usually happens within the country, right? More so because of the nature of how the protest emerged, right, that it wasn't limited to a particular community. The other aspect was that protest was being instigated by various different actors, and that instigation then evolved and people essentially piggybacked on the initial spark. And so the chapter that I think by Mary DeHaas really delves into this aspect of what happened in July and why July in particular was quite different from what traditional protest looks like. In the book, we talk about Susan Boyce's chapter, gives us the blueprint of all the types of protest activities that happen in South Africa, and the July unrest sits outside of that framework. And it becomes quite interesting because the question then is that something that will keep happening, or is it simply an outlier? And I think that's a question that we need to ask ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, that really is interesting. So now I'm curious about the blueprint around the types of protests that there are in terms of, in terms of how you categorize them. Maybe just share one or two of them with us.
Yeah, so obviously I don't want to give it all away.
No, we can't. We want people to buy your book. Yeah.
So Susan Boyson's chapter really deals with this idea of accumulating repositories of protest. And she goes from the idea that protests can be first service delivery related protests. They can evolve into broader issues with the national dynamic within the country. They can evolve into the idea of taxi drivers protesting is quite interesting, right? Because it's not located within a particular community, right? It's not necessarily located within the private sector, right? So it's not taxi drivers protesting against their owners, if that makes sense. But it's this idea that the taxi industry advocates for its own position against the state. And that form of protest, right, is a lot more disruptive than a service delivery protest. So the repositories, and there's about 7 of them that Professor Boyson lays out, she argues that all of these accumulate with each other and all interact with each other in different ways. And I think it's a fantastic way to kind of set out the foundations of what protest looks like in the country. But again, the other chapters then dispute that. And the other chapters, and that's the whole point of this book, to show all these different concerns around protest. The other chapters might dispute that and have other avenues. The one particular chapter that looks around protest against Shell and oil exploration off the west coast of South Africa. And communities, rural communities, white, black, were all advocating to say that you can't do this type of oil exploration, even though it is part of the developmental plan of the country. So we know that it might be beneficial to the country as a whole, but for our community, it will essentially eviscerate us. And that's a different process that doesn't sit within Professor Boyson's chapter, right? But the purpose of the book is to show us that there's all these different attempts to advocating for change within our country. And I think it's something that we haven't fully covered them all, but it's something that I think will spark more research into the field. Really,
really fascinating, because it's holding up a mirror in a way to what's happening in our society, and also giving us a framework that will assist us in how we interpret and respond to this. I wish we could talk more, because it really is fascinating and so timeless.
Rid of me.
What's happening in South Africa now. Thank you very much. Co-editor of that book, Protest in South Africa, Rejection, Reassertion and Reclamation. That was Rekgotsofetse Chikane. Thank you again for your time.